Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our very special edition of our International Economic Policy Forum featuring Bu Quang Vinh, the Minister of Planning and Investment in Vietnam until last year. And so we're very pleased here at the Institute for International Economic Policy to welcome all of you. This event is co-sponsored along with IIEP by the World Bank. We'll hear from them in a moment to introduce our main speaker and the Growth Dialogue, of which our speaker, in terms of our main discussant today, Danny Leipziger, is the managing director. I'm Stephen Smith, Director of Institute for International Economic Policy, and once again, welcome to all of you. We are the institute here that supports high-quality research addressing critical issues facing the global economy, primarily in the fields of international trade, international finance, and international economic development and poverty alleviation, and a couple of other key areas, including international business and global public health. You can find more about us on the web, very active website on gwu.edu/IIEP, our initials IIEP. So just for one additional minute or two of context, IIEP has 4 signature initiatives. I'll say just a word about each of these. One is on China's economic development and U.S.-China economic relations. And this talk today is an interesting and very important complement to that. We will be holding our 9th annual conference on China's economic development and U.S.-China economic relations a week from Friday, Friday the 11th. And we hope that all of you will be able to attend. It will be in this building, 1 floor down in the Lindner Commons. And you can find all of our previous conferences, including web video, on our website. A second signature initiative is on causes and remedies of extreme or ultra poverty. Just last week, we were co-host of the visit by the Nobel laureate, Professor Muhammad Yunus, who talked to us about the Grameen Bank, which he founded, and his innovative ideas on social business. A third signature initiative is adaptation to climate change in developing countries. Some of you here, I recognize, have been to our earlier events. And last but not least, our forum on global economic governance in the 21st century, our last major signature initiative. First week of February, we will have a major conference on wither trade, the future of international trade and international trade agreements. So thank you all for being here. Watch our events, our blogs and papers, and come again. And at this moment, I'd like to turn the podium over to Dr. Sudhir Shetty, who is representing our co-sponsor today, along with the Growth Dialogue, the World Bank, who will say a few words and introduce our special speaker for today. So, Dr. Shetty.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. And before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I'd like to thank you as well as Professor Leipziger from the Growth Dialogue for co-hosting this event today. Let me now turn to our distinguished speaker, Minister Vinh. As you said, Professor Smith was the former Minister of Planning and Investment in Vietnam. He served in that capacity between 2011 and 2015. The Ministry of Planning and Investment in Vietnam is responsible for preparing Vietnam's development strategies and plans, its public investment program, as well as coordinating overseas development assistance. So it was fitting, therefore, that in that capacity he was the main counterpart for this piece of work, which we call Vietnam 2035. And one of the things that's really noteworthy about this piece is that it's a truly joint piece of work. I have with me my colleague Sandeep Mahajan, who was the main author from the bank side. He led a very large team of bank staff, but we worked very closely under the leadership of Minister Vin, but with also a very large team from the Vietnamese side, from a number of ministries, including the Ministry of Planning and Investment. And so it's really great that Minister Vin and his colleagues have been able to come here to Washington to give all of you a sense of both the content of this remarkable piece of work, which really is a 20-year look at where Vietnam is headed. But in doing that, it also looks at the past and looks at why Vietnam is rightly considered one of the really remarkable success stories of development. So with that, let me invite Minister Vin to make his presentation. Minister Vin.
Kính thưa ngài Stevenson Smith và tất cả các ngài lãnh đạo của trường đại học và trung tâm nghiên cứu quốc tế của trường đại học George Washington.
International Economic Policy, the Institute for International Economic Policy of George Washington University, and also representative from the World Bank, and all of you who are interested in the content that I'm going to present today. First of all, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the World Bank for the arrangements and also for the support and facilitation by George Washington University so that I can come here and present a report on Vietnam with the vision for the next 20 years. And in terms of the timing, we have 1.5 hours. I will try my best to present briefly VN 2035 report following the slides or the PowerPoint presentations that we have prepared for about 25 minutes. And if shorter, it will be better so that we can spend around 1 hour for discussion. I think discussion is more important because on these, you can read in the report in English that we have distributed. Ladies and gentlemen, the VN 2035 report is quite volumic. It's about more than 500 pages, and there are many chapters. And let me present very briefly some of the main points. First, why 20 years? There are a number of people who say that 20 years is a little bit too long a time horizon. But in Vietnam, we have looked at it carefully, and we find that 20 years for Vietnam, especially for economic institution reform in a transitional economies like Vietnam, is an appropriate time horizon. If it is shorter, it's quite difficult for us to set the goal and the measures for implementation. Before talking about the directions for 2035, the VN 2035 team consists of the Vietnam side. Representing the government, we have one deputy prime minister and leaders and officials of the different ministries in Vietnam, and especially we also mobilized the leading independent economists in Vietnam and experts in Vietnam who have very reform-oriented mind and also great ideas and knowledge. And also we received the very strong support from the World Bank, who mobilized the leading experts from the World Bank and also involve the international economists and experts with experience, expertise, and knowledge to provide support the development of the report. So at the beginning of the report, we have the acknowledgement to express our thanks to the World Bank staff and experts, international experts and Vietnamese experts and specialists who were involved in developing the report. Today, I'm just the representative of the team to present about this report. So we have heard in the last 30 years of reform, Vietnam has been a success story of the world. And the outstanding achievements of Vietnam is shown through the following. First, you can refer to the two graphs, and I can say briefly. First, Vietnam's GDP per capita reached the average rate of 5.5% in the last 25 years, since 1990 to 2015. And economic growth rate in 25 years was 6.6%, and the income per capita increased by 5.5% on average. And from the graph, we can see in 1990, Vietnam's economy was only 6.5 billion USD, and in 2015, 190.4 billion USD, or an increase of 51 times. And in 1990, Vietnam's income per capita was only 100 USD per person per year, but in 2015, we reached 109 USD, and by PPP, Vietnam's GDP per capita was more than 6,000 GDP, and Vietnam officially became a middle-income country at the low end in 2009. And more impressively, the income of the bottom 40% of Vietnam has been increasing at the rate of 9.9% per year, or higher than the growth rate of the upper 60%, namely the middle class and the rich. So the rich-poor gap has been narrowed, and poverty rate has gone down substantially in the last 25 years. In 1993, the number or the poverty rate in Vietnam was 58%. Based on the poverty line of 1.9 USD per person per day. And by 2015, the rate was less than 4%, based on the poverty line of Ministry of Labor, Invalid and Social Affairs, MOLISA. And it's 7% based on the poverty line of the General Statistics Office of Vietnam, GSO. We have two numbers. The General Statistics Office of Vietnam, they still use poverty line of 1.9 USD per person per day, but they also incorporate CPI in this. But in MOLISA, Ministry of Labor, Invalid and Social Affairs, they didn't incorporate the CPI in the calculation of poverty rate. That's why we can see the difference. And another thing is the results of Vietnam's lower secondary education have reached the level of other countries in the world. And we have universalized lower secondary education. And life expectancy of Vietnam has increased from 65 to almost 74 in 2 decades. This shows the attention and care provided to the people. And the electrification rate is 97% nationwide. And in the rural and mountainous areas, the figure is 95%. And in terms of food production, in 1995, Vietnam were in the state of hunger, and we had to import rice. But now we have become the food or rice exporter in the world, the 4th largest rice exporter. And we have also reached a lot of changes from the lower middle income country to move to a middle income country. Besides paying attention to economic growth, Vietnam has always been paying attention to ensuring social equity and ensuring good social security for the citizen, especially paying due attention to the disadvantaged poor households. However, Vietnam needs to see one fact, that is Vietnam is still lagging behind, both in terms of income per capita and also the size of the economy compared with countries in the region, let alone countries in the world. On the graph, you can see that after 15 years, Vietnam's income per capita increased to 1,600 USD. However, compared with regional comparators, those countries with similar level and conditions with Vietnam before, they have increased. For example, Thailand, they have increased to 3,600 USD, Malaysia 6,500, South Korea 16,000. So Vietnam has high growth rate in income per capita, but looking at the absolute number, we are lower compared with other countries and we are lagging further and further behind. And in terms of the size of economy, by GDP, we can see that in the last 15 years, on average, every year, Vietnam had a growth rate of 6.6% to 7% per year. This sounds remarkable, but in terms of the real size of the economy, we can only increase to 160 billion USD. But in Thailand, the increase to 270 billion, Malaysia 200 billion, Indonesia 700 billion, South Korea 850 billion. So the relative number does not say everything. Looking at the absolute number, we can see that the gap is widened further and further. And another chart you can refer to is compared with the countries in the region and in the world, Vietnam is lagging quite far behind. On the two graphs here, you can see one compare between Vietnam and China. We can see that compare with China, Vietnam's average GDP growth rate is similar to that of China. And in 2014, we reached the GDP per capita of China in 2000, namely from the base year of the reform. After 23 years of reform, Vietnam's growth rate has been similar, and China reached 2,000 USD in 2001, but Vietnam reached this level in 2014. And we can see that compare with other countries like China, Thailand, Egypt, Brazil, Taiwan, etc. We can see that the gap in terms of growth rate and GDP per capita between Vietnam and these countries are being widened further and further. And in order to catch up with these countries and to reach their level of income per capita, Vietnam will have to make great efforts. Otherwise, Vietnam will lag behind very far. Even though we have rapid growth, even we have good growth, but we will still lag behind. And there are many other factors to show that Vietnam needs further reforms. The first round of reforms in Vietnam, we find that there are three reasons why Vietnam needs to reform. The first reason is Vietnam, in the very short remaining period when Vietnam can still tap on the demographic dividend. You know, the demographic dividend in Vietnam lasts around 50 years on average. And in Vietnam, it started in 1970. And if it is 50 years, then by 2020, Vietnam will have come to the end of the demographic dividend period. So Vietnam has only 5 more years where it can still enjoy the demographic dividend. And the second thing is the drivers of growth stemmed from the previous reforms are now running out of steam, almost run out of steam. and have little impact, less. So without reform, Vietnam will not have new drivers of growth in the coming period. And the third is Vietnam is on a path for deeper integration into the world economy, and therefore enhancing the competitiveness of Vietnam's economy is of vital importance. Vietnam has accepted to integrate deeply into the regional and world economy. Vietnam is one of the 12 countries involved in TPP and have signed many FTA like with the EU and countries in the region. And we are one of the open economy and ready to reform. And accepting to reform means you are in the shared playing field. And if Vietnam continue to have inefficiency and not good growth, Vietnam will not gain benefit. Vietnam will even face many more challenges. We will lose on our own playground, in our own market, not to benefit from the trade agreements. That's why we need further reform. And besides the need for reform, we have also listed out 5 opportunities and challenges, including those related to the bilateral trade agreements that Vietnam is engaged in, and as you can see here. And also, another is linked to an emerging China near Vietnam, and there are expected to be 1 billion people in the affluent middle class in 10 years. And Vietnam has trade relation with China in many aspects. So this is both the opportunity and the challenges for Vietnam. And another thing is a new technological and business innovation globally, such as solar energy, 3D printing, robot, next generation genome sequencing, are presenting Vietnam with opportunities and challenges in terms of technology development and adoption of new technology. And the middle class in Vietnam is rapidly emerging. And now in Vietnam, we only have more than 10% of the population being in the middle class. But by 2035, by that time, Vietnam will have 108 million people, and more than 50% of that will be in the middle class, namely the people with the income and expenditure of more than 15,000 USD and by 2035. And the next is the unfinished the next one is the opportunities that Vietnam will have to tap on, and the challenges that Vietnam will have to overcome. And the next is the unfinished economic modernization agenda. So the questions are as follows. In the face of opportunity and challenges as mentioned, what will be the future of Vietnam in 20 years' time? And what are the aspirations of Vietnam for 2035? And what will Vietnam be like? What will the economy of Vietnam be like? And what needs to be done to achieve Vietnam's aspirations in 20 years' time? These are the questions to be addressed by the report. And in terms of aspirations of Vietnam by 2035, we conducted the analysis together and came up with the following. That is, by 2035, Vietnam will be a higher-end middle-income country, and the GDP per capita PPP will range from around 15,000 USD to 22,000 USD, corresponding to the different scenarios for GDP per capita growth to become a prosperous, creative, equitable, and democratic society, as in the title of the report. So this is the aspirations and the goal that Vietnam wants to achieve in 20 years' time. And looking at this graph on the slide, you can see The first scenario is if Vietnam can tap on the growth potential and reach the target of 22,000 USD per person, the conditions will be our GDP growth rate should be 8% per year on average for 20 years, with an average increase in GDP per capita by PPP of 7% per year for 20 years. So that is the highest scenario. So China has achieved this. In the past year, China has always achieved this rate of growth. And in the initial years of reform, for 5 years, we achieved the average growth rate of 8.3% per year. And the next is the expected scenario, which is we reach the target of 18,000 USD per person. And the condition is that for 20 years, we reach the GDP growth rate of 7% per year, equivalent to the average increase in GDP per capita, PPP, of 6% per year. And the third scenario is the base scenario. Namely, we will reach 15,000 USD per person. And the condition is that the GDP growth rate for 20 years is at 6% per year, corresponding to the average increase in GDP per capita of 5% per year. So, in the last 30 years, Vietnam has achieved an average growth rate of 6% per year, which is higher than the figure in the base scenario. And we also come up with the worst case scenario. I'm very concerned that this scenario may materialize. It will be very challenging for Vietnam. That is, in case we cannot undertake the reforms as mentioned in the VN 2035 report, Vietnam can only achieve the maximum number of 12,000 USD per person per year by 2035, which is lower than the first scenario. And we cannot achieve the goal of becoming a higher middle income country as mentioned in the VN 2035 report. So that is the first scenario. Vietnam will continue to be inert and trapped in the middle income status, and even be lower in our ranking. And what we want is to achieve 18,000 to 22,000 USD per person per year. It may vary from year to year, but it should be at 7% or 8% growth in per year. So Vietnam can do this. We still have lots of potential if we can do good reforms. And in terms of achieving the goal, we have come up with 3 pillars and 6 major transformations. What are the 3 pillars? First, economic prosperity with environmental sustainability. And the second pillar is equity and social inclusion. Equity for everyone. Economic growth must go hand in hand with equity and social inclusion. And pillar 3 is a capable and accountable state. And we need to ensure that citizens can have their voice heard. And we need to make or undertake 6 major transformations. First, modernizing the economy and enhancing the competitiveness of the private sector. And second, developing innovation capacity, placing the enterprises or private sector at the center of innovation. And third, enhancing effectiveness of urbanization, improving connectivity between cities and surrounding areas. And fourth, ensuring environmentally sustainable development and building climate resilience. And five, ensuring social equity and inclusion for vulnerable groups, as well as the growth of middle-class society. And six, building a modern rule of law with a full and integrated market economy and an advanced democratic society. These are very major transformation. Vietnam have been working on this, but we have not finished the agenda. Vietnam need to continue to make strong efforts in undertaking these 6 major transformations. Now let's look at the first pillar, which is economic prosperity with environmental sustainability. We can see that since 1990, the labor productivity growth of Vietnam has been on the declining trend. Namely, we still have growth in labor productivity, but the labor productivity growth rate has been on the declining trend. This is worrisome, and this brings about challenges for growth and employment in the period leading to 2035. As you mentioned in the book published in 1994, Mr. Paul Krugman said, productivity isn't everything, but a country, whether it can enhance its living standards or not, depend on its ability to increase productivity per capita, or depends upon its labor productivity growth. This is the only path. So in Vietnam has still been seeing labor productivity growth. But if we look, we can see that labor productivity growth has been declining, and growth in general has also been on the declining trend in recent years. And you can see on the graph that the labor productivity growth rate in Vietnam has gone down from 5.4% in the 1990s to only 3.4% in the last 5 years, 2011-2015. And therefore, GDP growth rate in the last 30 years, we can see that in the 1991-1995 period, Vietnam's average GDP growth rate was 8.2%. After that, it gone down to 7% in 1996-2000 period. And in 2001-2005, only 6.9%. And then only to 6.3% in 2006-2010 period. And in the most recent period, 2011-2015, the average GDP growth rate was only 5.8% on average. So 8%, 7%, 6%, and 5%. In short, so Vietnam have been saying, and the world has also made the assessment that Vietnam has had high growth rate, but it's based on a very small size economy, and the growth rate has been declining by each 5-year period. This is something that we need to think about, and the major factor leading to that is the trend in productivity growth. And productivity growth rate in many sectors has been declining substantially. Besides the declining trend in overall productive growth. So we can see the declining trend in both the overall productivity growth and sectoral productivity growth. And in some sectors like banking and finance, construction, public utilities, usually they have a high productivity growth. But in the recent periods, the growth rate has not been positive, but even negative. And it is 2.4%, negative 4%, 2.1%, and negative 4.6% in banking and finance, construction, and public utilities. So these are very worrisome facts which are ringing the alarm. What are the factors leading to the decline in productivity growth in Vietnam? This is the question. The VN 2035 team have identified the following factors. First, there are no institutional foundations for a full market economy, like the policy framework for competition and enforcement mechanism are weak. The legal framework for protecting private property rights is unclear. And second, the land and capital markets are underdeveloped, with allocations being likely influenced by arbitrary administrative decisions and connections, not based on market principles. And third, labor productivity in the agriculture sector is very low, and agriculture now is assuming a large share of labor in Vietnam, and the land markets are malfunctioning, and we do not have policies for land consolidation for large-scale production. Our land is very fragmented, and land property rights or land ownership rights are not clear. And the state has been intervening too deeply, taking the place of the market, and there has been a too heavy focus on rice production, hindering innovations and the emergence of agricultural value chains. We are at the low end in the value chains and have very low productivity in agriculture, and we also have very weak supply chain linkages between domestic and FDI enterprises, with limited transfer of technology and business know-how from the FDI sector to the business to the domestic sector. And the SOE or state-owned enterprise sector has low productivity growth. SOE sector in Vietnam still take a very large share, and the SOEs, they are capturing a lot of valuable resources of the country and have preferential treatment in terms of capital and other privileges, but their performance are not in commensuration with the resources they occupy, and even there are lots of leakages, and this is one of the factors that hinder Vietnam's economy to grow well, and low competitiveness, and there is still a lot of overlaps and fragmentation in state management of SOE, with a lack of coordination, and SOEs are inefficient in their business and production operations. Wastefulness and leakages are still common. And six, for the domestic private sector, the productivity growth rate has been low and is now on a rapidly declining trend. This is worrisome. The private sector needs to have very strong growth, needs to be expanded in terms of size, and to have good productivity and performance. And in the report, we find that the private economic sector should be the pillar, the driving force for the economy of Vietnam. But the productivity is declining fast. Why? There are following reasons. First, the government still has not considered the private sector as a main driving force. There are only words said about this, but not specific mechanism to make them the main driving force. And there remain many areas of inequality between SOEs and the domestic private sector, undermining the competitiveness of the private sector. And the allocations in the factor markets, like capital, land, and natural resources, are not market-based, but mainly based on administrative decisions with lots of inefficiency. And one of the reasons leading to that is commercialization of state, and also the issue of vested interest and cronyism. In terms of solutions to increase productivity growth and economic growth, under Pillar 1, there are the following things. First, we have to create an enabling environment for domestic enterprises, and the immediate emphasis has to be on ensuring more competitive and productive domestic enterprises. And second, spurring learning and innovation. We need to build the foundations of a functioning national innovation system, placing the enterprises at the center of innovation and promoting entrepreneurship. This is a big issue and a challenge for Vietnam. Recently, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, Nguyễn Xuân Phúc, have said a lot about this, and we have issued lots of resolution. But how can we translate them into reality? That's the main thing. And third, we need to reshape the policies and investment to amplify economic density in and around large metropolitan areas. Or in other words, we need to increase the effectiveness of urbanization, and we need to promote the big cities to be the growth pole or to drive growth in the future. Now we have rapid urban development, but it's not efficient, and we are wasting land resources and creating lots of frustration and pressing issues. And we need to sustain the environment and ensure climate resilience. In the face of global climate change, and Vietnam is one of the 5 worst hit countries in the face of climate change impacts. And in terms of our reform agenda from short term to long term, we have the following things to do. First, we have to give immediate priority to productivity, to increase productivity in the domestic private sector by focusing on the following. First, strengthening the market institutions. And second, we need to clearly define the property rights by the private sector, and we need to have good competition policy and to enforce it and ensure fairness. And for macroeconomic institutions, we have to pay attention to budget management and central bank. And we need to liberalize the factor market, especially markets for land and labor. And also we have to restructure the SOE sector to pursue the equitization agenda and eliminate the privileges for SOE, leveling the playing field. And we need to strengthen governance and ensure transparency.
Làm sao để cổ phần hóa mạnh mẽ doanh nghiệp để tăng thêm cái hiệu quả kinh tế.
The thing is, we need to make strong efforts to equitize and to enable the environment for the domestic private sector. Now the SOE is taking the space, and the private sector can do better. So the principle is whatever the private sector can do better, we should let them do it, even in public services. And the next is we need to strengthen participation in the global value chain. We need to build backward linkages between FDI and domestic private firms. We need a more proactive approach to get FDI companies to transfer technology and capacity to local firms, and look for Vietnamese companies to be at the head of the global value chains by 2035, like Samsung of South Korea, Huawei, China, Tata of India. They should be the leading private companies. And we need to have modern service sectors. This will be an important input for manufacturing exports, currently a critical gap. And we need dynamic, innovative, and competitive domestic firms. And the next thing is on modernizing agriculture. We need to generate more from less, namely enhancing efficiency, especially in agribusiness. And we need to install flexible land markets to solve the problem of land fragmentation, which is a recipe for low productivity. And we need to consolidate the role of the state. And we need to create the environment for land consolidation. And we need to consolidate the role of the state and take more market-driven approaches, like strengthen technical and regulatory services and fix the inefficiencies in public investment targeted to rural infrastructure, and foster a private sector-oriented agribusiness environment. And We need more flexibility on land use. Balance between national food security and commercial interests of farmers could be rethought. We shouldn't focus on rice production too much with very low productivity, and the commercial value is very low. And we need to fix fragmentation in supply chain organization by improving vertical coordination in the supply chain and support collective action at farmer level so that we can develop large farms for agricultural productions. These are the agenda from short to medium term. For the long term, we need to promote entrepreneurship and develop the private sector and improve trade connectivity to tap on the opportunities for some key sectors in the global value chain.
Tăng cường nền tảng kinh tế vĩ mô để
And we should also strengthen the macroeconomic foundations for private sector development, restructuring the SOEs, etc. So you can see clearly, because of the time constraint, let me not go into the great details. And another thing is we need to develop the innovation capacity and develop the innovation system, which is demand-driven. And in terms of foundations for the national innovation system, we can find here, and the demand side, there are two things that Vietnam has to pay attention to. That is the need for innovation by the enterprises, and also their absorptive capacity. On the supply side, we need to have the research and development system and the skilled labor force to create the supply to meet the demand. And we need to switch the focus more on demand. And on the demand side, we need to focus on the enterprises and make them dynamic and develop a large number of innovative and dynamic firms to generate demand for innovations. And the government need to have policies to eliminate the barriers for different types of businesses to increase productivity and provide appropriate support for different types of enterprises.
Nữa là cần phải nâng cao cái năng lực đổi mới sáng tạo của doanh nghiệp.
Another thing is we have to increase the innovation capacity by adopting technology from overseas, and also to increase the quality of governance, etc. On the supply side, we should focus on the most talented and productive researcher, focusing more on research, knowledge, and advanced human capital.
Trong các doanh nghiệp của Việt Nam là rất thấp.
Now, adoption of technology and knowledge in enterprises in Vietnam is very limited, and we should have performance-based resource allocation, not input-based allocation in Vietnam. Now in Vietnam, we are doing it on an input-based basis, only focus on the input and not on the results. And this is a weakness, and we need to integrate the research and education, postgraduate education, and to tap the most advanced knowledge through international linkages, and to remove the barriers in the higher education, to move towards a modern education system for higher education, meeting the demand of the students. And these are the different directions to increase the innovation capacity. And fifth, to enhance the economic efficiency of urbanization. There are some points here. First, to promote the economic density in and around the large metropolitan cities, and also the potential secondary cities, and also to create the connectivity and specialization, and to remove the barriers in terms of access to the social services between the migrant and also the urban residents, and also to boost the positive impacts of urbanization. So now we have a big numbers of migrants from rural areas to urban areas, like in Ho Chi Minh City. The number has amounted up to 12 million people, and there are around 4 million immigrants. The immigrants, they do not have access to basic social services, for example, education for the children and other opportunities. And in terms of the main policies, first, we need to develop the land market and to strengthen coordination in planning and the quality of urban planning, and also integrate or combine the transport and logistic master plan, and also improve the quality of road and transport and urban infrastructure. And we need to have the policies to achieve sustainable development. So we have to integrate the or to build climate resilience into economic planning and infrastructure development, restore and sustain water resources and air, and restore and sustain land resources. For all the three groups here, there are 4 requirements. First, we need to calculate the cost accurately and to formulate further policies on pricing and ensuring that the needed financial resources are always available. And fourth, managing transformations so that the changes do not affect the poor adversely. So that's the end of the first pillar. Pillar 2 is equity and social inclusion.
Ở đây có mấy cái nội dung chính.
There are a few points I want to mention here. Besides the achievements and also the fact that Vietnam pay attention to equity and social inclusion, there remains many challenges under this pillar. A lot of issues to address. For example, the 2014 statistics show considerable inequality of opportunity between ethnic minority groups and majority groups. The poverty rate of ethnic minority group is much higher than the national average. The ethnic minority children face higher inequality of opportunity, which you can see from the graph. And Vietnam also have emerging issues. For example, by 2035, Vietnam will have nearly spent its demographic dividend, and the share of population above 65 years of age will have doubled by 2035, namely an increase of 7.1% or 6.5 million people. It will increase from 6.5 million people in 2015 to around 14.5 million people by 2035. And by 2035, more than half of the population will enjoy the global middle class. Now it's only 10%, but in 2035 it will be more than 50%. And there are many other issues. For example, children and people with disabilities and many others that you can see in the report. So, in terms of promoting social inclusion and equity, we need to have policies to reach these requirements. For example, in social policies, we have to switch the focus from quantity to quality and change the role of the state in different social aspects, and to balance the interests of different strata and create consensus in the society in undertaking reform, and to reshape the social policies to be relevant in the face of demographic shifts. And when we have reached the social policy vision, or when we have said that, it is necessary to sustain social development indicators. So here, we mention the different programs to ensure equality of opportunities. So, for example, reducing the barriers to opportunity for ethnic minorities, and to de-link the household registration system from access to public services, reduce gender gaps, continue to implement the program for sustainable poverty reduction, etc.
Trong cái giai đoạn tới.
And the next thing is supporting the growth of the middle class, meeting the demand of the middle class. And the last pillar is on building a capable and accountable state. This is a pillar with lots of challenges and difficulties, not just in Vietnam, but in all the countries, because reforming ourselves is very difficult. So now in Vietnam, there are a few shortcomings. Vietnam's ranking on governance is low for its level of income. Compare with countries with similar level of income as Vietnam, Vietnam ranked low on governance. On all indicators, Vietnam's ranking are equal to or lower than those of lower middle income country. And on voice and accountability, Vietnam remains in the bottom 10s of all countries. As you can see here, China and Vietnam, low. And also, enforcement of laws is weak and inconsistent. Inconsistencies among the different ministries and also provinces. In terms of measures to help achieve the goal, first we have to strengthen the capacity of the state, applying market rationality in state decision, clearly define the role of the state and the role of the market, enhancing the security of property rights, enforcing competition, reducing direct interventions, and enhancing the effectiveness of state regulation of economic activity. The main important thing is how to apply market principles. And we have to clearly define the space of the state and the space of the market. And not to have too many direct interventions in economic activity. And we also need to reform the central-local relations, reform the relationship between Prime Minister and ministries to increase the autonomy, accountability, and performance in each agency in the whole system. So these are the key issues in Vietnam. Overlaps, duplication, there are things no one is responsible for. There are things many entities are involved. So it leads to the situation where no one takes the responsibilities and also they pass the ball even between the different ministries and also with the Prime Minister. And also we need to improve public administration. And we need to reform the civil service and change the role of the state from producer and owner to regulator and facilitator and service provider.
Và phải nói rằng là
And we need to broaden the participation of all actors in delivering public services. So the government only facilitate the provision of services and regulate it and involve the private sector in delivering the services. And B, enhancing the capacity for public service delivery, we need to base on the demand of citizens and enterprise to design the apparatus to build a developmental and facilitating government. We need to build a disciplined and meritocratic bureaucracy. We do fall short of talents in Vietnam, but we do fall short of talents in the bureaucracy. We still do not have good policies for that. And discipline in the system is still weak. We need to upgrade the compensation system, and this is very important to attract and retain the required talent.
phải xây dựng Quốc hội trở thành một cơ quan có tính chuyên nghiệp.
And next, we need to enhance checks and balances. We need to develop the National Assembly into a professional body consisting of full-time deputies with oversight of all the state's operation. Enhance the independence and professionalism of judiciary system.
Ngành như là kiểm toán.
We also need to enhance the role of specialized oversight agencies such as the State Audit of Vietnam, the Government Inspectorate, Ministerial and Subnational Inspectorates. We need to put in place mechanism to control use of power and avoid abuse of power in legislative, executive and judiciary system. Fourth, we need to ensure citizens' voice is heard and incorporated in lawmaking and governance. We need to broaden the space for social organizations that represent the citizens and enhance the legal framework to allow establishment of associations by the citizens and establish mechanism to ensure timely access to accurate information by citizens and enterprises and enhance accountability of the state and ensure independence and transparency of the mass media. This is also a big issue.
Cuối cùng, báo cáo Việt.
And finally, the Vietnam 2035 report I have presented very briefly is a report on Vietnam's issues. examined by national and international experts in an effort-intensive and serious manner to help come up with major transformations for Vietnam to embark on to develop in the next 20 years. Vietnam is at a turning point on its development path. There are tremendous opportunities on offer, as well as major challenges and difficulties. To achieve the aspirations to move toward a prosperous, creative, equal, and democratic Vietnam, the only viable choice is for the country to carry out a bold program of reforms that is consistent with the pillars. We are confident that current and future generations of Vietnamese people have the strong will, the spirit, capacity to implement the reform agenda successfully. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.
Thời gian còn lại thì
For the remaining time, we are keen for us to be engaged in discussions. And please raise the questions, and we are willing to discuss with you about VN 2035 report as well as socio-economic development issue in Vietnam. We stand ready to share. And now, please, the floor is yours.
We'll first hear some words from Dr. Andy Leipziger, a professor here at the business school and the executive manager of the Growth Dialogue. Danny.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Minister Vinh, for your presentation. I think for those of you that don't know the minister, he's one of the great reformers in Vietnam, and I think you can tell from his assessment that it was a very honest assessment of what works and doesn't work well. So I want to just have three major points. One, we look at Vietnam today, we should take 2 minutes to look back and see from whence it came. Second, it has very lofty ambitions, and the question is, what are the major challenges? We've heard a grand list of interventions, which is reminiscent of fantastic World Bank reports, but we have to focus in on a few that may really matter. And third, the world is changing, and what we think will work may not work in 2035. So on the first point, and thank you, Stephen Smith, for hosting, and Sudhir Shetty, the chief economist of the East Asia region, for organizing this and inviting me. So if you look at Vietnam starting in 1990, when it moved to the market, and you compare it to 2015, that 25-year period, some fantastic things happened in terms of improvements and economic welfare of the Vietnamese. So just 5 factoids. In 1989, the inflation rate in Vietnam was 300%. For those of us who went there for the first time, to go to dinner, you needed a package of a wad of currency that you put in your backpack. So that inflation came down to almost zero in the following year. Number 2, the movement to the market mechanism, starting in agriculture, was dramatic and swift. Some countries struggle with this. Vietnam did not. Economic growth, as the minister showed, if you look between 1990 and 2010, you really have an average of 7%, which means that it would have fit the criteria of the elite 12, as we would call them, in the Growth Commission report, the Spence report that looked at countries that grew at 7% or more for 20 years. Accomplishment 3. Accomplishment 4, if you look at the poverty rate, I mean, whether it's 4 or 7 is irrelevant. The point is it's single digit. And if you look 20 years or 25 years before, it was considerable. So a fantastic movement, and the fact that the bottom 40 have gained more than the average means that the income distribution has not been worsening tremendously. And number 5, Vietnam was able to join quickly into global value chains and produce for the export market, and that has worked well. I think you should also consider two other facts, which is that Vietnam has always been open to learning from others, learning from the region. The World Bank in 1992 organized an important quiet meeting between Vo Van Kiet and the economic team and the DPMs from Malaysia, Korea, and Indonesia to chit-chat about what works and what doesn't work. And some of the people in the room are in my class, so they know this story already. But the Vietnamese delegation asked, what should we do with the Russian debt? You know, we owe 10 billion rubles. We don't exactly know what the ruble was worth, but it was a big number. And the Indonesian delegation, because this was a quiet and informal, unrecorded, and WikiLeaks didn't exist then, kind of meeting, the Indonesian head of delegation, Vijoyo, said, just delay, delay, delay. That's what we did with the Dutch debt, and it served Vietnam very well, because the Russians soon forgot about it. And the last point on the history of Vietnam is that in 1991, when the World Bank was involved with Vietnam and its market reforms, the Vietnamese official in charge of foreign visitors, Vu That Boi, said, we need to teach a new generation of Vietnamese about economics. What book should we get? And they subsequently wrote to Paul Samuelson and got permission to translate Samuelson's economics textbook into Vietnamese with no royalties. So learning from others, being ambitious, and being smart about it has paid off. Okay, point number two, the challenges of getting to be Malaysia by 2035. I mean, you saw the various possibilities. You know, you could be Malaysia in 2005, you could be Malaysia in 2015. But essentially, how do you move up the chain from being lower middle income to upper middle income? And so I have 5 things that I picked out, which have all been mentioned, but I think one can't give equal weight to everything. So point number 1, I think Vietnam needs greater emphasis on market-friendly institutions, right? I think regulation, competition, financial oversight, anti-corruption agencies. There's a good model in Indonesia, KPK, which could be used. I think that would be important. Second, the private sector. So the minister has been very honest and candid. I will be equally honest and candid. I no longer work at the World Bank, so I can say anything. I'm in an academic institution. State enterprises need to shrink. They're inefficient. They're in the wrong sectors. They're getting too much credit. The private sector will not flourish with the state enterprise sector taking all the sunshine away. So you saw the chart that looked at, you know, public utilities, most inefficient. Okay? I have a solution for that, Minister. We take the worst public utility and we market it out, we outsource it to Singapore. If it's the water authority, let the Singaporeans provide water. If it's electricity, let them do it. You need to show the state enterprise sector that they're not going to be protected from competition and they can't be inefficient. Point 3, urbanization was mentioned. I think it's, you know, one of the keys, and we spoke about this when I was in Hanoi. There's a lot that has to do with land markets and movement of people and trying to get the benefits of agglomeration without the downside. I think if you look at the urbanization trends in Vietnam, it is on the rising slope of urbanization. Therefore, if you think ahead for 2035, you got to start dealing with infrastructure and connectivity now. Otherwise, you'll be playing catch-up, and that is very costly. Number 4, the other inefficient sector, apart from utilities and construction, was banking and finance. So I think credit is going to the wrong people and maybe for the wrong reasons. I think there's work to be done there in moving from state ownership to more competitive structures. And the minister mentioned the better functioning of the state. It needs to be more modern, more accountable, more transparent, with better governance. I think we can all agree on that. So I think if I had to pick 5, those are the 5 I would focus on. And I think the report has, in its 360 pages, it has plenty of information on all of them. Issue 3, and then we'll move to questions, is that the world is changing, right? If we had seen this report 20 years ago, or even 10, we would have said, well, global trade is booming, export strategies are going to give you the best bang for your buck. What's the problem, right? But here we are in 2016, 7 years after the Great Recession, and we're still in a world of very anemic growth. We have very high output gaps. We're underproducing. Plant and equipment investment in the advanced economies is not moving up. FDI is slowing down. And as the IMF reported in its annual report, trade volumes are diminishing. So this is not a benign global environment. And one can talk a lot about this topic, but I would just say the implication for all countries, Vietnam included, is that you have to be super competitive and super efficient, right? Being average is not going to do it. So I think some of the attention on productivity and other measures of competitiveness is well taken. Change number 2 in the world is that there's what we call disruptive technologies, right? And there was a slide that talked about 3D printing, artificial intelligence, robotics, everything else. Okay, this is a problem in developed economies, right? And we've heard a lot of noise in this election season in the U.S. about job losses. But the point for an emerging market that wants to move into Malaysia's spot is that we no longer have this ladder where you automatically can move up by being more competitive, because global value chains are changing, right? If I can do something with 3D printing, I don't have to send the shirt, into 4 different countries to get it done. So I think there's change in the air. FDI may become less important. Domestic resource mobilization may become more important. But basically, we have to accept that there's greater uncertainty in global trade and in global value chains. And somewhat related, and my last point, is that in the last year or 2, there's been a lot more conversation about the issue of deglobalization, right? The model that has served us well is under some scrutiny. There's some voices of retrenchment out there. And we know that China will rebalance. We know that advanced economies have issues of their own. We're seeing less trade, less voluminous capital flowing. The question is, will this lead to a inward-looking global economy? I still think that for most emerging markets, exporting gives you a yardstick, lets you know when you can compete and where. But it's also fair to say that the bang for your buck, as we say, may be less in a world that is less robust in terms of trade. So we don't know exactly where this globalization, deglobalization debate will come out. Nevertheless, it means that governments will be more stressed to manage their situations well. I think Vietnam is fortunate to have officials of the caliber of Minister Vinh. He and his team, I know, worked very closely with the World Bank and turned out a very good report, which hits all the right topics. And so if Vietnam's choice is to be whether in 2035 they are Brazil in 2014 or Malaysia in 2006 or, there are a lot of countries in the world that would that wouldn't mind those choices, wouldn't mind those options. And if you can continue your growth rates as you have in the past, I'm sure you'll be very successful. So thank you very much for your presentation, Minister.
So as we heard a moment ago, the minister has kindly offered to open up the floor to questions for him about the report. So does somebody have a question?
Thank you, sir. Okay, so firstly, I want to thank Mr. Bùi Quang Vinh and his team for the devotion to work on such a detailed and precise paper. But also, I have questions for you and your team. Is that we all know that Vietnam's potential development for economy relies a lot on creativity, freedom, and openness. And in order to unlock that potential, it is required that the Vietnamese government, particularly the Communist Party, needs to reform for more democracy and freedom of speech. However, well, it is known that the Vietnamese parliament has a lot of policies that can impede the development of many startup companies, particularly the criminal code of 2015, Article 292, which will criminalize the startup companies which has internet business without the certification of the government. And I just want to ask your opinion about that. Thank you.
Minister, if you would like to take the podium to answer questions, we would be honored.
Về câu hỏi này thì chúng tôi muốn trả lời thế này thôi. Bộ luật hình sự của Việt Nam ấy thì
Criminal Code of Vietnam in 2015, we had some amendments and additions, amendment of many articles. And the idea is to reduce criminalization of economic activity. That is the idea. To reduce criminalization, we remove the article on the kind of deliberate wrongdoing in economic activity. So we reduce the risk for startup activities and business activity in general, and create the condition for the people and the enterprises so that they can use their money for investment. So if we criminalize everything, we will hinder the startup spirit and the business activities. However, in the amendment process, as you may have watched it, maybe because of time, and also because the team drafting that, the editing team may make some mistake or oversight. So the National Assembly adopted it in 2015, but recently the National Assembly itself identified many points that are not relevant and contradict with other laws. Now the National Assembly has demanded that we stop implementing the amended articles and review again to ensure or to review it to ensure consistency with other laws, and also to ensure that we can implement the ideas I have mentioned. And same for Article 92. There are some regulations that tie up the enterprises, especially in IT. So we will need to amend it. We are in the process of amendment, and I am confident that in the process of amending it, we will create the condition to not to criminalize economic activity, except when they violate the laws. Yeah. So that is the idea that I want to mention in my answer in terms of freedom of speech. Now, Vietnam is moving in these directions, and of course, different countries have different paths or process for ensuring freedom of speech. And now the media and the press agencies in Vietnam, they have very strong voices in many aspects, but different countries, they have a different process for development. And there are also different understandings and different levels of democracy. So I think Vietnam is moving towards greater freedom of speech. And in this report, we also say that we need to ensure independence and transparency in the operation of the mass media. And we mentioned this in the slide. And in the Vietnam 2035 report, we say this is a requirement. And thank you for the question.
We have 3 questions. Why don't we collect the 3? I think you can see those 3.
Thưa Ngài,
Your speech today really broadened the knowledge of myself and everyone here. So nice, so good. My question is this. I'm very happy that 1 or 2 months ago, Mr. Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Vũ Hồng Nam, invited me, gave me an honor to attend a conference in Ho Chi Minh City from the 10th to the 14th of this month. And the participants of the conference, the objective is to encourage and create opportunities for Vietnamese people in foreign countries all over the world, like in Germany, US, etc., to contribute their knowledge, capital, and expertise that they have gained and developed in many countries. So the task is to focus on Ho Chi Minh City. Although Hanoi is the heart of the country, but Ho Chi Minh City is the commercial center. So contributing to modernization and industrialization is about implementing resolution 36 of the Central Party Committee from 2002 to 2020. So we talk about the possibility of that program, and this program can contribute to the objective that you have mentioned today. So what is your assessment? Oh, thank you for your question. First, you speak Vietnamese very well. And I must express my thanks because you spent a long time in Vietnam. And you represent GE corporation in Vietnam in the very initial days when Vietnam was still under the embargo. So for your question, I would like to mention this. If you have been watching, especially US citizens have been watching it, we can see Vietnam has put in place very open policies in many years, especially recent years, for Vietnamese expatriates in other countries. And the Communist Party of Vietnam, the state of Vietnam, have seen the great role of national solidarity. This is at the heart. Vietnamese people in any countries, their origin is still Vietnamese. And the party and the government of Vietnam have to value the Vietnamese people in all over the world and to bring them together to contribute the country. And this is a policy, and it's mentioned in the resolution of Vietnam, including the resolution under the 12th National Party Congress for the next period. And Vietnam is developing policies and mechanisms gradually to mobilize this human resource and financial resource from the Vietnamese expatriates to contribute to Vietnam's development. We need to tap on their knowledge, experience, and also economic resources and knowledge, like Professor Ngô Bảo Châu. in Vietnam, when he come back to Vietnam, the Secretary General of the party and the Prime Minister and many one really appreciate them, and many other Vietnamese people. So gone are the days, when there were certain gaps between Vietnamese expatriates with the Vietnamese nationals who live in the country. Now the gap have been removed these days, long ago. And I can name many policies allowing the Vietnamese expatriates to have the same rights as the national living in the country. Now, before the foreign countries, they can buy the houses based on their investment project, but Vietnamese expatriates, they have many rights as Vietnamese people living in the country, including owning the house. So we need to have these policies to mobilize all Vietnamese people to contribute. And I think all Vietnamese people want to contribute to the country development, and the state sees the need, so that we have solidarity. And this is they are also the bridge between Vietnam and also the host countries that they live in. So I highly appreciate this, and in all aspects we are very supportive of the idea or policy that all Vietnamese people in the world, whatever citizenship they take, they are still Vietnamese people, and they are the resources of Vietnam. And Vietnam now, we have to go for many foreign investors. Why not go for investment contribution by Vietnamese expatriates? And we need to find ways so that they feel Vietnam is really their homeland, their home, so that they come back and build the country. Thank you very much.
We are technically out of time. However, I think that
Microphone. If you speak loudly, I cannot hear. Sorry. Yes. Vâng, chúng ta đang sắp hết giờ. Thế nhưng mà chúng ta còn có 1-2 câu hỏi khác nữa sẽ được hỏi. Thế thì chúng ta sẽ nghe 2 câu hỏi một lúc. Mỗi người đặt câu hỏi thì nêu rất là vắn tắt thôi. Chỉ đặt câu hỏi thôi nhé. Dạ. Xin mời ạ.
you would recognize let's do the 3 people who have their hands up, including the 2 who had them before. Again, brief and a question only. Thank you.
Dạ, kính chào Bộ trưởng Vinh ạ. Cháu đang học
Minister Vinh, I'm studying economics in George Washington. I want to raise 2 questions. But as required, I can only ask one question. My question is, as the minister has mentioned, according to the new law on business, the government of Vietnam has switched. That is, they can only do business in areas that the government permits. Now, people can do business in areas that the state doesn't prohibit. So I think this is very open. Now, the government, the state is calling for startup. And many young people in Vietnam, they focus on services or trade because it requires small amount of capital and easier to do. But for development, Vietnam have to focus more on high technology. So for startup related to high technology or production in the areas of high technology, now the government of Vietnam, or by 2035, what are the specific policies of the government of Vietnam? Any?
Đúng như bạn sinh viên vừa mới nêu.
So, as you have mentioned, đó là ý là nghe 2 câu một lúc ạ. 2 câu hỏi một lúc, sau đấy thì Bộ trưởng trả lời ạ.
For your talk. My question has to do with the energy sector. I know that Vietnam has made a huge investment in nuclear power plants, but I noticed in the report, you do still have a huge problem with energy inefficiency. So what plans are there to rework the energy sector so as to get the maximum benefit of those kinds of investments in nuclear power plants? Thank you.
Quyên nói lại cái câu hỏi cho anh.
First of all, thank you very much for this talk and giving us your valuable time. My name is Gaurav. I'm a Fulbright Scholar at School of Business at GW, and I was recently working in Vietnam with something related to TPP and exports to US. My question was related around TPP. A lot of things you've talked about are domestic solutions that Vietnam needs to work on. But I was wondering how much does TPP come into play, or other free trade agreements come into play in these sort of making these solutions work in terms of driving things like labor law changes. And also the next question is, especially given the current environment where TPP is having a lot of issues from both the American politicians, have you sort of taken that into account in the 2035 plan? If TPP doesn't get ratified, where does it take Vietnam if TPP doesn't go through, or if it does go through, would that change a lot in terms of what you've laid out today? Thank you.
Cảm ơn ba câu hỏi. Và
Thank you very much for the three questions. Let me answer the first question by the student. So we can say that one of the biggest ideas in amending the law on business and law on investment in Vietnam in 2014 is about following the amended Constitution of Vietnam in 2013. And the idea is the citizens have the right to do business in areas not prohibited by law. This is a statement in the amended Constitution of Vietnam. This is a step forward in ensuring human rights, and we are the drafting team. The law on investment and the amended law on investment in business. So we follow this idea. That is, we follow the Constitution, ensuring that the business and the people can do business in areas and sectors not prohibited by law. And before the law in 2005 were drafted based on the principle that we selected the areas to allow people to do business. But now we have the kind of negative list. Yeah, so the positive list means whatever they can do business in, we will write in the law. That means they are allowed to do business in this sector, this area. But in the world, there are so many lines of business, many sectors. And every hour, every day, there are new areas of business because of technological advances. So no law can mention exhaustively what we allow. That's why we create the back and receive mechanism. That means besides what is allowed by the state, then the investor have to ask for allowance or permission. And in different ministry, they have different mechanisms. So there are a lot of malpractices. So now in Vietnam, we move on to the negative list. This is transparency and advanced methodology. And not all countries can follow this methodology or dare. Negative list means we only mention what is prohibited in the law. And if it is not prohibited, anyone can do it freely. Of course, there are many risks. For example, many areas, in fact, we should prohibit, but we kind of miss that or forget that. But we have a mechanism to review the negative list every year. And negative list is a very advanced, very good mechanism. So the MPI of Vietnam, we have to work with different ministries, and we are under great pressure to mention the areas in which we prohibit. And we have narrowed down the negative list, now only 6 areas. And for 7 176 areas. There's no prohibition, but there should be conditions. For example, they need to protect the health, the public health. If they are involved in the food business, they need to ensure food safety, etc. But everyone can do business, and everything is made transparent by, we put it on the website of the government, the negative list, and the domestic and foreign enterprises, they can click into the website and know what's in the negative list, what's in the positive list, etc. And in the business license, we don't mention the areas of business they are allowed to do. They can do business in any area they like. So these are the amendment in these two laws. These are great step forward. And next thing is for startup, especially for high tech. In the report, we mentioned greatly about the startup spirit. We need to create a startup movement in the country, so that when they have idle money, we don't need to put in the bank. They use for investment and business to create lots of income, legitimate income for themselves, and to promote development in the country. This is very important. So the thing we need to do here is the state should create the enabling investment environment, making it most favorable for people who have money for investment. Now in Vietnam, we still have lots of barriers, shortcomings, and risk. And this is something that Vietnam will have to embark on. And we also prioritize a lot the production sector, the real sector. Now most people are involved in the service sector, but we need to create, to manufacture the products. So of course, service is important, but production is also very important, especially in the high-tech area. So now Vietnam has a law on high technology, namely all the sectors that are recognized as high-tech, they get the best preferential treatment and incentives. And now we have the law on supporting small and medium-sized enterprises. The MPI is in the lead. So we also have lots of incentives to support the SMEs, especially in high-tech. And when will the law be adopted, and what are the policies we will need to work further on this? But the idea is to be supportive of this. And the second question is on reworking the energy sector and also nuclear power plants. Vietnam is a country with quite rapid growth, as I have presented. On average, 7% GDP growth rate per year, and it entails the more energy use. So for 6 and 7% growth rate per year, we need to increase energy consumption by 13 to 17% per year. So we have huge need for energy. So now reworking or restructuring the energy sector in Vietnam is a big issue. Vietnam is involved in the Paris International Convention on responding to climate change. And Vietnam accepts to reduce greenhouse gas emission as required. So now the government of Vietnam, in the energy mix, we have set the requirement, that is to gradually get rid of the coal-fired thermal power plants, which are polluting, and encourage the clean power plants like wind, solar power, and bio fuel power. And we have the incentives, and they get higher tariff. And many enterprises from Germany and other countries are investing in wind power in Vietnam, especially in the south. And also for hydropower, we will also work on that, but we have to consider there are two sides. It can create a cheap tariff, but it have huge environmental impacts, including flooding. It's dangerous. In Vietnam, we identify that. We also develop the nuclear power. We have 2 big nuclear power plants, one in collaboration with Russia, one in collaboration with Japan. We have nuclear power plant, one in Ninh Thuận, and nuclear power plant Ninh Thuận 2. But recently Vietnam kind of put a pause on it, because we have not been able to be certain about nuclear safety. And also the return on investment of these 2 plants have to be reconsidered. Thus now, scientists are debating. They say this is not safe. There is a huge potential for geological breakage, and it's dangerous. And another thing is the tariff of these 2 nuclear power plants are unreasonably high. So we have to revisit the return on investment. But I think in terms of developing nuclear power plant, many countries in the world, they have done that and can ensure safety. Vietnam will do it, yes. But when? We need to, now we are still reviewing the 2 projects to ensure higher return, more effective. And the next is on TPP.
Thái Bình Dương thì Việt Nam là một trong 12 nước tham gia.
Vietnam is one of the 12 countries and one of the first countries. 10 years ago we have been involved, and by now Vietnam have signed the agreement. But we find that if the TPP go through, it will also create pressure. As in the report, we say there are 2 sides. First, if we are in PPP, Vietnam will benefit. First, Vietnam will need to be in the shared playing field. And the legal system, policies, mechanisms must be in line with international practices. This will create the pressure, and this is a source of pressure for reform. National Assembly of Vietnam has to be ready. That is, Vietnam will have to revise some dozens of laws to be in alignment with TPP. And this is the driving force for reform, so that Vietnam has the legal framework and the playing field like in other countries. And second, to create an open economic space, especially in terms of export, with a lot of incentives. I'm one of the members involved in negotiation of TPP. In the last terms, I was involved a lot. So it creates lots of advantages for Vietnam. But in Vietnam, we also see the negative side of PPP. If the Vietnam's economy cannot be reformed and we continue to face the challenges, as I have mentioned, without being able to enhance productivity, and especially TFP, total factor productivity, is important. It's not to ensure economic growth rate by increasing capital and exploitation of natural resources and cheap labor. If we cannot enhance our economic competitiveness, we cannot tap on the opportunities of the trade agreement. And we can even lose our advantages. We will have to face greater challenges and difficulties because we have to open up our economy. And when we open up the economy with the ailing health, with the crippled economy, we will lose the market, the domestic market, let alone the export market. So recently, without being involved in TPP, only in some FTA, the wholesale and retail market of Vietnam, we have lost it to to many FDIs. So besides the benefit, there will also be lots of things we will lose. So if we can enhance the competitiveness of the economy, we will benefit from TPP. Otherwise, Vietnam will suffer more from the losses, or the losses may outweigh the benefits. But we are confident that we can promote the growth better And we mentioned that in the VN 2035. And we say we need to enhance productivity growth through technology, innovation, scientific development, which we have been talking a lot. And these are the ways for Vietnam to benefit more compared with the losses when we are involved in the TPP. Thank you.
On that very positive and optimistic note,
Vâng, tức là tôi thấy là một cái tinh thần rất là lạc quan, rất là tích cực. Bác ấy không nói vào cái micro ấy. Microphone, it doesn't work. Tôi xin cảm ơn Bộ trưởng rất là nhiều ạ.